gives us a chance, and I continue to be somewhat optimistic about our opportunity as a state to do something differently than we've been doing for 15 years, and that's through the reauthorization of ESEA. And ESEA and No Child Left Behind really, I felt like did a lot of damage and a lot of harm, to schools. And again, it was a system that quite honestly didn't make sense for a lot of reasons, but we had to deal with it because it was mandated that we deal with it. So now through ESSA, and I do want to give a lot of credit to our parent organization, AASA. They were instrumental in getting some things done on Capitol Hill that hopefully will make more sense than what ESEA and No Child Left Behind meant for education and educators. So as a state, we have an opportunity through ESSA to do some things differently and hopefully for the right reasons. And so as a result of that, we brought some folks together in March, and Steve, I think you were in that meeting in March, and the contention is that, and I'm going to go back to where I started earlier in this meeting, is making our voice heard and making our voice relevant. And I want our voice heard and I want our voice relevant in this conversation about ESSA and education policy in the state of Indiana. So we met together in March and we had a conversation about teacher evaluation, accountability, and assessment. And there were several very, very bright individuals in that room, and we broke up into groups to have conversation collectively. And so there were superintendents and curriculum coordinators and assessment folks that were having that conversation collectively and then talking about each one of those topics. And then at the end of each one of those topic sessions, they were to develop recommendations that we would all culminate and come together with on what we wanted as an association for accountability, for assessment, and teacher evaluation. Ultimately, at the end of the district meetings, it's my intention to put those comments and things together before it will go back to the work group, and so that they have the opportunity to vet it. And then after they have the opportunity to vet it, I will share that with you. After you have the opportunity to vet it and we can put something together by way of consensus as an association, it's my intention to submit that position on behalf of IEPSS to the State Board of Ed, to legislators, to DOE, to anybody that's going to be instrumental in taking a look at ESSA and educational policy that, again, allows us as a state to do some things differently. So that's kind of what we're doing as an association on behalf of you and ESSA. So does that make sense to kind of take that directionally? I'm going to get your input. And again, it's to make our voice relevant and to be heard. Will it do any good? It remains to be seen. Now, with that being said, I think it's important for you to continue to message with your legislators at a local level. It's important for them to hear you and your feelings about where we should go with this as a state. The reason that's important is it may not resonate with them locally, but when they get into a caucus situation during the legislative session, at least they're going to be armed with information and a position that they can counter other positions that will come up in the caucus. And I'll get into that here in just a little bit. But your voice is relevant, and I continue to hear during the legislative session, well, my superintendent said, or I heard from superintendents and they said. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't have any way of knowing. But they use that leverage to say that educational leaders said, to create a position for them and to create relevance for their position when they're talking to the caucus. I think it's important for you to really have those conversations with them on a regular basis, either formally or informally. so that they understand what educational leaders and the leaders that should be at the table when all of these decisions are made, and they know what those positions are, and hearing it from you and why it makes sense. So, again, that goes back to relevance of leadership in the state of Indiana for education, and it does make a difference. Following up on that, I sent you a save the date for June 22nd, and that continues to be another conversation about ESSA. It's going to be at the JW Marriott in downtown Indianapolis. It will be a full day, and I believe I indicated that the first 100 people to register will be registered for free. So I hope that we have several people there. I know many of you are on vacation or have other obligations then, but would love to see as many people there as possible so that you can learn more about ESSA, especially on a national level. That will be in conjunction with the regional meeting for NWEA. And it won't be with NWEA, it will just simply be in conjunction with. So I'm assuming that you might have principals or assessment folks or teachers that will be attending the regional meeting with NWEA, and that'll be a great opportunity for you just to kind of interface with them at the same time. So questions about that? Okay. I'm going to move to the legislative things right now, and I have no intention of going through every one of the bills. I'll just highlight a few of them. We had 17 House bills that were education related that passed, and we had 21 Senate bills that were education related and that passed. So I'm going to make some comments on that, and I will probably also interject some observations and opinions. And my initial observation going into this particular session was that we were going to have a legislative session that was going to pander to the teacher vote and to educators. And they realized that that's a huge block that they have the opportunity to garner a significant number of votes from. They realized that by what they're doing by analyzing votes from previous elections and how that affected the outcome of the state superintendent's race. So they know that teachers and educators can sway an election. So right from the get-go, I kind of felt like through observation and seeing some of the bills that were introduced that was actually going to be a lot of the tone that was going to be set in this previous legislative session. So right out of the get-go, and I will kind of digress here again just a little bit. It's hard for me to stand back here, so I apologize for that. We had a conversation, I don't remember if it was last fall or last spring, but in one of our district meetings, where we were suggesting that DOE get out front of the implementation dip. And we saw the implementation dip and the effects that it had in New York State. We saw the implementation dip and the effects that it had in Kentucky. Kentucky handled it much differently than what happened in New York. And it was a nightmare for New York, and Kentucky mitigated some of that damage because they got out in front of it with some messaging about what was going to happen. And I suggested to DOE that they take a look at what happened in Kentucky and that perhaps we kind of look at that model and do something similar here in the state of Indiana. Well, time went by, and it didn't happen. And that's when I came to you and said, it's not going to happen through DOE, so guess what? I felt like that's something that you needed to handle by messaging in your community with your board and with your teachers, because it was going to happen. We knew it was going to happen, and it was just a matter of how bad would the damage be. So lo and behold, probably in November or December before the session started, I'm going to say that the bill was already written and ready to go on January 4th, where the legislators could come in and they would be riding the white horse, and by golly, we're going to save education, and we're going to do something for teachers and educators to mitigate the unbelievable damage that was going to be caused by a dip in test scores. And so that's what they did. So right from the very beginning of the session, they introduced 1003 and Senate Bill 200, which were the hold harmless bills. And aren't we the good guys, and by golly, look what we're going to do for educators here in the state of Indiana, and aren't you glad that we're going to be the saviors for all of this? Both of those bills came through both houses very, very quickly, and of course went to the governor's desk for signature very, very quickly. That obviously established the tone for what other bills were going to look like in this session. If that's what they were going to do from the beginning, I was expecting something similar with other bills that were going to happen, and quite honestly it did. Most of those other bills had less substance to them, and many of them were simply feel-good bills about pay attention because this is what we're doing for you educators. It's not going to be to you, but it's going to be for you in this session. And so another bill that came through was House Bill 1002. A lot of conversation was centering around what are we going to do about the teacher shortage? What are we going to do about teacher recruitment and retaining high-quality teachers in the state of Indiana? Well, you all are dealing with that. And in another district, we had a superintendent that had just finished up the awards banquet in their district with all of their top 10, top 20, top 100 students. And he polled those high-performing kids in his district and said, okay, how many of you have any intentions of going into education and becoming teachers? 2. Now that's the pipeline. And so we have repeatedly told legislators that this is an issue and that they need to take a look at how we're dealing with educators and how we're treating education in the state of Indiana, none of which they have any responsibility for, by the way, with any of their actions previously. So they introduced 1002, which is called the Hoosier Educators Bill. And the Hoosier Educators Bill was to have you have the opportunity to talk with your high school kids about going into education, especially those that were in the top 10 or top 20. Is there any money behind that? Or is there any teeth behind that? No. It's another one of those, but by golly, we're recognizing that that's a problem, so we're going to write this bill and we're going to give you that opportunity to do that. So that was 1002. 1109 extends the use of CPS for utilities and insurance payments. And quite honestly, every time that we talk with them is, why don't you just make it permanent? Instead of having a bill every 2 years that continues to extend that, or better yet, fund that obligation that is an ongoing obligation in the general fund where it should be paid from. Of course, I don't want to hear that. It also extended circuit breaker relief for school districts. Now, a lot of conversation happened between the Senate version of this bill and the House version of this bill because the Senate version of this bill reduced the number of school districts that were captured in the waiver. And the Senate said this was never intended to be permanent relief, and we're going to continue to wean school districts away from this waiver. I will tell you that many of you would have been captured in the Senate bill and would no longer have been eligible for the waiver from circuit breakers. A lot of damage would have been created. Now, going back to the conversation is we don't want to create controversy for education. The House and the Senate compromised on this bill and said, no, we can't do that because there will be a lot of school districts that we rely on as voting blocks, and we don't want them to be exempt from the waiver. So they acquiesced on the Senate side and went with the House bill, and so the number of districts that were in that initial waiver continued to be there. So that was part of that. And then it also established the 20-day rule for the distribution of performance grant money. 1395 was the late bill that introduced the elimination of ISTEP and set up the panel for the assessment group. So there's 23 members that are on that assessment panel, and 4 of them are superintendents. How those 4 superintendents will be selected, I have no idea. Who the chairman of that group will be, I have no idea. Now, there was a rumor in the district meeting yesterday that it was going to be Representative Manning that was going to chair that group. Anybody? I'll get into that here in just a little bit too. Now, a bit of a bright spot, I feel like, is that how many of you know who Mark Teen is, superintendent of Westfield, Washington? A few of you. Mark has been a superintendent at Westfield, I think, for 19 years, and he just retired. Part of his retirement vision was doing some things to continue to foster different feelings on the legislative side with the governor in public education. And so Mark is going to work for DWD and the governor's office. Now, that's a good thing for us. Mark would like to have one of those 4 superintendent seats to represent us on the assessment panel. Now, for those of you that know Mark, he is a big NWEA proponent. And I don't know where you all come down on NWEA, but when the Best Test Bill was introduced in the last session, I testified in favor of that bill. And Senators Mishler and Kenley were the ones that introduced that bill. And they wanted something that makes sense for the right reasons for kids and for teachers. And whether you accept NWEA as an acceptable measure or not, it's certainly better than what we have. So that has elicited a lot of conversation around formative assessments that will make sense for kind of tracking kids throughout the year that will also drive instruction. That's the conversation that Mark will have on that assessment group. Now, the individual that I just mentioned, Representative Manning, is not a proponent of formative assessments, is not a proponent of any test that makes sense. He is a proponent of ISTEP or an ISTEP-like test. DOE has repeatedly said, we own the bank of test questions. Now, when they make comments like that, my fear is that when they say we own the bank of test questions, is they will create another ISTEP. So, if you have particular feelings about an assessment, whatever it is, that is going to make sense for your teachers that will drive instruction and raise the quality in our classrooms, that will make sense about how we look at kids, please share that with your legislators. It's important that you share that information with legislators, again, for the same reason. Manning will drive the conversation about where this is going to go, and he will drive the conversation in caucus because the Speaker of the House just says whatever we're going to do in education, and he acquiesces to Representative Manning. If you have feelings about that, please share it with your local legislators so when they get in the caucus and Manning will drive another conversation, they can talk in a educated manner about what you all want. This is another way for us to drive the conversation. This is another way for you to be relevant in the conversation about shaping what we want for education in the state of Indiana. Very, very important, in my opinion.
JT, I had the opportunity to sit next to Senator Cruz when we held a legislative luncheon down in Indianapolis in February this year, and we had a conversation about NWEA, and he immediately said, well, no, that's a formative assessment. And I think we need to take the position that it's not a formative assessment, it is a summative assessment that you can give multiple times. Because as a summative assessment, it not only tells you what kids know, it also tells you what they don't know. And that is really what a summative assessment is all about. We know at any given time what kids know and what they don't know. So actually, it's a summative assessment every time the kids take it. And I know, at least from Senator Cruz, he listened because he hadn't thought of it that way. So I don't think we ought to let people say it's a formative assessment because it is a summative assessment.
And we know that we have to end up with a summative assessment, but it doesn't have to be anything close to what we have now. And so NWEA has indicated that they can craft a summative assessment without any difficulty whatsoever that meets the Indiana standards. So, I mean, they're kind of behind the scenes. They're not out in front because they don't feel like that's the way they want to operate. But in my conversations with them, they're very clear that they can do anything that needs to be done to meet those standards. And I'm not saying that NWA is the end-all be-all, but it's a pretty good example of some things that can happen that make sense for educators in the state of Indiana and for kids. 1209 was a Spanish language proficiency to be shown on the diploma. So if you have high school kids that take 3 or 4 years of Spanish and they're proficient in Spanish, Tony Cook, many of you know Tony, that was a retired superintendent, is now a state representative, crafted this bill, and that will be shown on a diploma if those kids are Spanish language proficient. 1219 is that all diplomas will be offered in all high schools. Now, to my knowledge, that already exists. And Julie, I think your point was that that's the bill that all diplomas will be offered in all high schools. And does that exclude freeway schools? There's no mention of freeway schools. So I'm assuming that if you're an accredited high school, that you will have to offer all diplomas that all high schools offer. 1290. And again, some of you are affected by this and some of you are not. It's called the Dark Stores Bill. And this is the bill that really was Myers and big box stores like Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that are located in a strip mall. And the small dress shop goes out of business in the strip mall, and all of a sudden the assessed value for that vacant store now becomes the assessed value for all other stores in that strip mall, including the big box stores. Well, that had the potential for being significant in a drop of AV for you, a significant drop. But it was upheld by the Indiana Appeals Court when it went to the appellate court. And the legislature had a hard time dealing with a bill that was all of a sudden upheld in the court system. What are they going to do to overturn a bill that had already gone through the appeal process, and now what are we going to do? So this bill dealt with, Senate Bill 1290, dealt with a solution called segmented market value to mitigate the damage that would occur if this happened with a big box store in your community. And Jane is pretty familiar with that. So Jane, would you want to kind of speak to what that means?
Just a couple highlights. There is now a whole list of criteria that you're supposed to use, and it clearly says that market value is not one of those criteria. Brian and I this week have been tag teaming on this. VLGF, we're expecting to put some rules together on what exactly assessors are supposed to use. But one thing to remember, this is a compromise, so there's a good chance that it's not going to be everything we would have wanted, and so continue to watch.
Brian, you want to add?
I think the only thing I'd add is last year, the legislature claimed they fixed this. The assessors, after the session, said no, they didn't. The assessors were correct. This year, the assessors aren't saying anything, passing judgment. So maybe there's a 50-50 chance this will address and solve the problem.
Okay. Well, don't know that it's going to completely solve all of the problem, but it's certainly better than what it could have been. It's a pretty big deal that at least something was addressed with this. Okay, another bill that dealt with education and educators, 1370, and that's the requirements for your dual credit teachers. Now, we've been given a bit of a reprieve through 2023, I believe, for how we look at the credentialing for your dual credit teachers. They want it to be the higher ed commissions, when I say they want it to be the master's degree plus 18 hours. And so for most of you, that's going to be a big deal. So the legislator passed a bill 1370 for incentive pay to give to teachers that earn that master's degree plus 18 hours. Now what they didn't do was give you any money. And so they basically would say, if you think it's important, you find the money. And obviously it's important to you. It's important to your kids, it's important to your community members to have a kid walk across the stage with 18 college credits in their pocket. That's a lot of money. And so, not quite sure where this is all going to land as far as the credentialing for your dual credit teachers. We really don't have to worry about it until probably 2023 or before, but it is a big deal. And of course, they're not going to put any money into it, but it's another one of those bills that say, we're trying to help you out here, and we understand your pain, and we're going to put something together to mitigate that pain. It's not going to be in the way of money, but we're going to help you out. Okay, on the Senate side, again, Senate Bill 3 provided technical corrections for that huge bill from last session, Senate Bill 500, which dealt with Title 20 and a lot of data reporting and a lot of duplication of information. Because of the size of that bill, we knew that there were going to have to be technical corrections, and so Senate Bill 3 dealt with that. Senate Bill 93 was the kitchen sink bill in this session, and there's always one kitchen sink bill, and Senate Bill 93 was that bill. There were a lot of bills that didn't get passed, got tossed in, where a lot of amendments that weren't heard got tossed in. So this was a pretty voluminous bill that had a lot of things in it. And it extended the financial management agreement for Gary schools. Obviously, that's a big deal for the Gary schools. An issue that could come to roost that we don't know about yet is turning over water testing to EPA. And EPA is supposed to come out with guidelines and regulations for schools about what you're going to do with water testing. And obviously, it's what happened in Flint, Michigan, and what happened in Eastern Howard with lead in the water. Who knows where that's going to end up? Arsenic, I understand, has become another issue for some of you in your water testing. What this could translate to is an additional cost for you. And where are you going to get the money? So I'm just saying, put that on your radar screen as part of your watch list, because EPA could come out with guidelines and say you must do this and you must do that, and you're going to have to find the money to do it. Again, a conversation with your legislators about that. The other part of this bill, or another segment of this bill, is charter school authorization that requires public hearings. So if a charter school wants to come into your district, they must conduct a public hearing. That's a good thing. The part of this bill that bothers me is they made all charter schools public school corporations to the extent that any federal or local or state funding, they now have the ability to be looked at as an independent school district. Now, that in and of itself really is not troubling, but it's the next step in the next session that could be troubling, and that is affording them taxing authority. And they have always contended that we don't have any taxing authority to do things with our facilities or to do things with transportation. And that could be the next step. If they're going to identify them as a school corporation, just like you are a school corporation that has taxing authority, I can see that being the next step. So again, if they do that, they're going to thin the pie out again. Keep your eye on that. Some of you don't have to worry about it, but collectively we all have to worry about it because it's going to thin the pie if they're given taxing authority. Many other study committees were established for this: school calendar functions, determining graduation cohort, dual credit language for students and teachers with a master's degree in 18 hours, the ability to enter into a separate agreement with a teacher outside of the collective bargaining agreement. And then this one was kind of at the end of the session that got put in there, is special education accounts and scholarship funds that are funded by vouchers. And so again, this is another expansion of vouchers that kind of got thrown in there for special ed kids. And so If they can take the IDEA money that you have and take it away from you and go to a private or parochial school by way of a voucher, thins the pie again. And it's another expansion of vouchers that kind of quietly got passed through. Now, while we're talking about vouchers, how many of you are familiar with the crossing? Anybody? Probably a few of you. There was a bill that was introduced that was absolutely specific for the crossing. Now, it's amazing to me that we can have a piece of legislation that is introduced that's specific to an entity like the crossing, which is a private school. Okay? And so when that bill was introduced, it was introduced as using vouchers for alternative education. There was no mention of alternative education, but it simply was an expansion of vouchers by allowing vouchers to be issued in the second semester as well as the first semester. So in reality, it was just another expansion of vouchers. Because the crossing came out and testified for this bill, because they would be the beneficiaries of this specifically, we had a couple of superintendents that testified in favor of it. Now, I need to know from you, not here right now, but we've always testified against vouchers. It's always been our position to testify against vouchers. I testified against the bill and said to the committee, why don't we use the $86 million that was spent in vouchers last year, and if you want quality alternative education programs, put $86 million in our existing alternative ed programs and see what kind of results that you get. And so I guess it's troubling to me that as an association, I can't pick and choose when we accept vouchers and when we don't accept vouchers. We either take in a position for them or we take in a position against them. And so I'm taking in a position against them, and probably, unless I'm told by our executive committee not to do that, we'll continue to do that, because I think that there are ethical and moral issues in relationship to the use of vouchers in public schools. And so if you tell me differently, then let me know, because I'm going to continue to testify against vouchers. The Crossing is a private school that was started in northern Indiana, and quite honestly, it would appear that they're just marching down 31 and picking up school districts. They can not only get ADM, but now they can get vouchers. And again, so when they're taking ADM away from school districts and they're also getting vouchers, I don't think that's a good model that we need to support. So think about that, and let me know if you want me to take another position on that. Senate Bill 126 is posting of financial data, expenditures and fund balances on the transparency website at DOE, and how you deal with the summary of your performance information. Senate Bill 147 is a Homeland Security bill, and it turns over guidelines and recommendations for school districts to Homeland Security. Now, I guess I shouldn't be suspect of that, but if they come up with regulations that are expensive for you to implement, that's going to be a problem for you. And again, this bill went through both houses unanimous, and on its face, it doesn't look like a bad bill until Homeland Security comes up with all of these guidelines and regulations that they expect you to follow, and that if one of your neighboring school districts accept these guidelines and implement them, it's going to put pressure on you to do the same. Don't you want your kids to be safe like XYZ school district next door? And so, again, that particular bill and the guidelines that are going to come out of this, I would suggest that you all need to keep a close eye on. Senate Bill 234 requires all head coaches and assistant coaches to receive concussion certification training, and if they become certified in concussion, with the concussion training, it gives them civil immunity from damages. So obviously that's a good thing for your coaches, but has implications for your head coaches and your assistant coaches and for your ADs. So if you aren't aware of that, I'm just kind of putting that on your radar screen for that concussion training and certification is a good thing. It does not apply to your intramural sports program. Senate Bill 251 establishes an out-of-school advisory board for your before and after school programs. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it could, if you're currently using YMCA or community centers for your before and after school program, and mom and pop want to get involved with this, it could open the door for those mom and pop shops to get involved with this through this advisory board, because it establishes policies, procedures, and funding levels and eligibility requirements that will go to the General Assembly November 1st of 2016. Pardon me. 279 expands the number of registered voters required to trigger a monstrance from 100 to 500. So this was really favorable for school districts. It also gave school districts to an extent, if they had already passed a referendum, to extend that referendum through through the development of different language that will go on the ballot. Honestly, I was surprised that this bill passed. I was really not expecting it to pass. It didn't pass without some conversation and controversy, but it was a good thing. So, Jane, do you have any comments that you want to make on the monstrance bill?
Yeah, just a reminder, it's the lesser of 5% of registered voters or 500. So if you have 10,000 registered voters in your school corporation, then you can use the 500. So 500 people would have to file the petition to request the petition remonstrance race of the referendum. If you're something less than that, then you got to look at the 5%.
Thank you. Okay, Senate Bill 301 really deals with workforce development and what we're going to do with DWD and how we're going to craft workforce development in the state of Indiana. Obviously, our current governor, that's one of his big platforms is vocational education and career education. And this is a bill specifically through DWD that will help with that. Now, I call it the Ivy Tech bill because it actually creates two vice presidents for Ivy Tech. One in the north and one in the south. And through these regional workforces, really what they're going to look at are the skill sets that are needed regionally, and then those will be offered through Ivy Tech. So it's not necessarily a bad bill, but it gives Ivy Tech a lot of power and a lot of leeway in this skill development in these regional workforces. Now, the other aside to this is that if this current governor is not reelected, what's that going to do with DWD and what they're going to do with regional workforces? Because this was all developed because the current governor, that was his big push. And Steve Braun, who is the commissioner for DWD, I think is doing a really nice job in making sense out of all of this. But if the governor's not reelected and we get a new governor, all of this could be thrown into a state of disarray. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see what happens in November. Senate Bill 307 is the only bill that I'm going to speak to that did not pass. Did not pass. This is the consolidation bill. And this bill was introduced by Senator Kinley. Had several conversations with Senator Kinley about the structure of this bill. And my position has always been that if this is a local control issue and controlled locally, and that's what your local voters want, and that's what your local school boards want, okay, I'm all right with that. The bottom line is that he listened to some of that conversation. He is a huge proponent of consolidation because he feels like that will save the state money through consolidation. The bill did not pass. Now, Scott Turney and maybe some of you in this room went up and testified. Scott Turney did a really good job of getting superintendents to testify against this bill, the Small Rural Schools Association. I will tell you that that Senator Kinley was not happy. And my fear is that if Senator Kinley gets reelected, he's going to come back with a much more onerous bill in the next session. So I don't think this horse is down and dead. So this is something for especially small and rural schools to continue to watch and monitor. And especially if it comes back more onerous next time with different language. So I would expect that to happen. So just kind of keep your ear to the track on that one. Senate Bill 308, again, applies to a lot of districts that are sitting in this room because it's how agricultural land is assessed. And in many areas, your ag property has escalated in value to the point where farmers have said enough is enough. You know, we like the fact that if we sell our land and it's highly valued, we can get a big return. But a lot of these folks want to continue to farm and not pay the higher assessed value taxes on this property. So Farm Bureau brought this bill to the legislators' attention and crafted a bill that will use a capitalized reduction formula. And so this is a big deal for you all that have a lot of agricultural land in your district, and you need to pay attention with your assessor's office about what's going to happen here. And so make sure you're talking with your assessor's office and making determinations about any impact that this could have. Jane, would you again want to comment on that?
Sure, thank you. In 2019 is when this is really going to kick in. And under the current, or the previous calculation, your acre base rate would have been $16.30. There were some changes that got made last year, and I'm sorry, it would have been $3,000 per acre. Then last year's changes made that $2,300. This year's changes make that $1,630. So that's a substantial decrease in the value in the acreage. Those don't kick in until 19, that severe drop. So there's some talk on the street that this was partly done to get the governor reelected. So it's possible that prior to 19, maybe next summer, there'll be some study committees on this. So watch this, talk to your legislators about it. A couple things to think about. To the extent that the agricultural AV decreases, that means in some districts your overall AV is going to decrease. Lower AV means that in order to get the same levy, your tax rate will need to increase. So even though many of you are working hard to keep that levy flat, it could be your rate's going to go up. That also means more people are going to hit the circuit breaker quicker. So be thinking about that. The other is that it's likely there's going to be a shift. So your residential people are going to end up paying more in taxes and potentially the agricultural less. So think through that a little bit in your own districts and talk to your legislators. I know UMBA's working quite a bit with their clients on how this might affect them.
What is the current
I was
base
afraid
rate?
you
Is
were
it like
going to ask me that.
2,200? 2,200, give or take?
I think that's right. I just don't remember.
And so,
I'm sorry.
again, to make that point again, if
It'll
that
gradually
goes into
drop.
effect, you're talking about $600 per acre on every acre of farm ground. That's significant for those of us that have.
And if you've been following Farm Bureau at all, they have been so happy about this bill.
I'm a member of the
I
Farm
mean,
Bureau.
you've got the newsletter, social media. I mean, they've been ecstatic about it, and this is why. But people now, the government folks have to get out and talk about what this means to the other taxpayers too.
This is a big deal.
That'll affect you if you have big TIF districts too, that were farm ground before they were established.
A lot of significant implications in this bill. So you really need to kind of arm yourself and pay attention to what this could do for you, against you. Work with your assessor's office, make sure your board and community is aware about what's going on and why. So again, something for your radar screen. Senate Bill 321 changes several of the reporting dates to DLGF. And again, something for you to pay attention to and communicate with your treasurers and business managers about. so that you don't miss a date that you need. Senate Bill 335, school corporations may assign wages and pay premiums for collectively bargained health insurance and is not required to make the collectively bargained health insurance available to all school corporation employees. Don't know why they needed to have a bill like that, but at any rate, that's what Senate Bill 335 is. So those are the bills that I just kind of wanted to highlight and go over with you. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, JT, I just want to go back to House Bill 1330. You didn't talk about that one. That was a bill that passed 46 to 24 in the Senate. Senator Kinley actually got up and spoke in opposition of the bill because there's a part in there that says provides for certain performance-based accreditation provisions do not apply to charter schools. And so Senator Kinley spoke in opposition to it. Senator Cruz stood up and said, well, you know, the Department of Education is for that bill. I contacted John Barnes at the Department of Education. Therefore, other parts, but not that charter school portion. I just want to warn us, just like vouchers, you know, they just keep giving concessions to charter schools and ignoring us, and I think we ought to be in opposition anytime that happens. I don't recall hearing about that provision in that bill until the day before it actually went to the Senate floor, so I don't know how it got in there, how long it was in there.
That was one of those bills that there were either 12 or 16 amendments that were introduced on the floor. And when you have that many amendments that are introduced on the floor before a bill is heard, it's hard to keep track of them and what they are, let alone be prepared to speak to them. So when we hear about those things, obviously we speak against them. I will indicate to you that on the legislative side of things, Greg Hinshaw obviously is the chairman of our legislative committee, and Greg will be sending out a survey to you here pretty shortly. Don't know when, but pretty shortly, my guess. And so that we can put together a legislative position going into this long session. So he will be surveying all of our members so that we can garner ideas from you about positions that you want us to take on the legislative session coming up. We'll have that information ready for the session when we meet together as a group with policy and resolutions and legislative in the summer, and then bring those positions back to you at the fall conference for a full vote in September. So that'll be one thing to look forward to. Some future dates for you to just kind of put on your radar screen. April 20th, our Professional Development Committee has put together a nice program for you all. That session is moved from the Palms to Brownsburg, the Brownsburg Conference Center. We got late notice from the Palms that they couldn't accommodate us, and so we had to change the date. Jim Snapp, superintendent of Brownsburg, was on the phone within 3 hours and offering his facility to us at no charge, so we really appreciate that. May 3rd, cybersecurity in schools. If you have any trepidation about cybersecurity in schools, and you should, this might be a session that you either want to attend or send someone to attend. That will be at the Palms on May 3rd. The President's installation, Dr. Jeff Hendricks, will be at the School Town of Munster on June 10th. June 22nd, I mentioned to you, ESSA and you. September 9th is the Prospective Superintendent Seminar, and some of you have attended that before becoming superintendents. That requires a superintendent's nomination to attend. So if you have somebody in your leadership team that you would like to send to that, we would appreciate it. The Fall Conference, downtown Indianapolis, September 26th and 27th. I will tell you, we've included CEL, which has discontinued their conference, Advanced Ed, which was having trouble with their conference, and then we also included small and rural schools in the discussion for all of the presentations made at the Fall Conference. We heard through the evaluations last year that there weren't enough sessions for small and rural schools, so we asked Scott to contact so that we could develop some sessions for small and rural schools, which we have done. With the inclusion of Advanced Ed and CEL, we really feel like that we have a dynamic agenda. set for you for the fall conference. Excuse me, the governor's candidates will be there on Monday to speak in the general session, and the state superintendent candidates will be there on Tuesday to speak at the general session. So really that's the essence of the fall conference. And then of course our conference is December 4, 5, and 6 at the Hyatt downtown. We got really good feedback about moving the conference to the Hyatt downtown. We hope you feel the same way, and we'll attend. And again, we encourage you to bring your spouse so that they can enjoy the amenities in downtown Indianapolis. So that's about all I have. Do you have anything for me? Okay, with that being said, I really appreciate all that you do and the leadership that you provide for public schools in the state of Indiana. Thank you for that. I'll turn it back over to Steve.